April 1876. A country house in Balham, just outside London. A young barrister sits down to dinner. Comfortable, wealthy, recently married into money, surrounded by servants and every outward marker of Victorian success. He has, by any reasonable measure, everything. 4 days later, he's dead. Poisoned, slowly, agonizingly, over several days, while doctors stood around his bed and watched, entirely unable to save him. And here's the part that makes this case unsettling, even now. The poison didn't come from a stranger. It came from inside the house, from someone who knew him, someone he trusted enough to sit across the dinner table from that night. And nearly 150 years later, we still don't know who did it. Welcome back. This one doesn't end with a trial, or a hanging, or a tidy resolution. This one just stops, which in its own way is rather more disturbing than if it hadn't.
Charles Bravo was, on paper, a man doing everything right. A young barrister, ambitious and reasonably successful. He'd recently married into considerable wealth. His wife, Florence, had brought him a beautiful country house called the Priory in Balham, the kind of comfortable, servant-staffed home that represented, for a Victorian gentleman, more or less the entire point of working hard and marrying well. From the outside, it looked like a life assembled correctly. Money, status, a lovely home, a beautiful wife. On the evening of the 18th of April, 1876, Charles returned home to the Priory after a day in London. Florence had been entertaining guests earlier that evening. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have struck anyone as remarkable. The couple appeared, at least to the outside world, to be living a perfectly comfortable married life. Behind the polished doors, though, things were considerably more complicated. In the early hours of the following morning of the last dinner, Charles Bravo became violently ill. At first, it looked like sudden, severe sickness, the kind of thing that could, in 1876, plausibly be attributed to any number of ordinary causes. But as the hours passed, his condition worsened rather than improved. The doctors attending him began to suspect something more sinister. He might be poisoned. Later on, the substance was identified as Tartar Emetic, a compound containing antimony, capable of causing exactly the violent, prolonged suffering Charles was now experiencing. And this is the detail that makes the case disturbing. The poisoning wasn't quick. Charles didn't simply collapse and die. He suffered for several agonizing days, while doctors worked around him, trying and failing to save his life. And the household around him slowly transformed from a comfortable country home into the centre of a deepening, unresolved mystery. Because poisoning of this kind doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen at the hands of a stranger passing through. Whoever had done this had been close to him, someone inside the Priory itself.
As Charles lay dying, suspicion inevitably turned toward the people closest to him. Florence, his wife, became one of the central figures in the growing investigation. Some believed she had a clear motive: the earlier scandals in her past, the complicated realities of a marriage that may not have been quite as comfortable as it appeared from outside. Others argued, with equal conviction, that she was simply another victim in all of this, a grieving wife, watching her husband die, now facing suspicion on top of tragedy. Florence Bravo, née Campbell, was a wealthy widow when Charles married her. Beautiful, well-connected, and, on the surface, exactly the kind of match a young, ambitious barrister might have hoped for. But Florence's past carried weight. Before Charles, she'd been involved in a previous relationship that had already generated scandals, one that Victorian society, with its particular gift for never quite letting go of a woman's history, had not forgotten. Because in 1876, appearances mattered enormously. A woman's reputation, once shadowed, tended to stay shadowed, regardless of how respectably she subsequently married, regardless of how carefully she conducted herself afterwards. Then there was Dr. James Gully. A well-known and respected physician, Gully had been connected to Florence before her marriage to Charles, a relationship that had contributed significantly to the earlier scandals attached to her name. His continued presence in her life, even after her remarriage, generated exactly the kind of gossip and suspicion that Victorian society thrived on. Was he involved? Had old feelings resurfaced? Had jealousy, on someone's part, curdled into something considerably darker? Suspicion swirled around both of them, and around others in the household besides. But suspicion, however persistent, is not proof. And proof, in this case, never arrived.
Charles Bravo died on the 21st of April, 1876, 4 days after that ordinary dinner at the Priory. 4 days of suffering that doctors had been powerless to stop. His death, once the cause was confirmed as poisoning, became one of the most talked about cases in the whole of Victorian Britain at the time. An inquest followed. In fact, an unusually lengthy and thorough one, even by the standards of the era. Witnesses were questioned extensively. Household servants gave testimony. The relationships between Charles, Florence, and Dr. Gully were picked over and over. Newspapers covered every development with breathless enthusiasm. Rumours multiplied faster than facts could be established. And despite all of it, despite the attention, the investigation, the public fascination that stretched on for months, the case refused to yield an answer. No one was ever charged, no one was ever convicted. No confession from anyone at any point was ever made.
And here, I think, is the genuinely haunting part of the Charles Bravo case. It's not just that nobody was punished. Victorian justice, whatever its flaws, was frequently swift and often brutal. We've covered plenty of cases on this channel where the guilty party was identified, tried and hanged within months of the crime. This case never resolved. The evidence pointed toward the household, toward someone close to Charles, but never pointed clearly enough at any single individual to secure a conviction. Was it Florence? A woman with a complicated past and perhaps a complicated present, driven by motives we can only guess at now? Was it Dr. Gully, an old flame, still entangled in Florence's life, perhaps unable to let go, perhaps threatened by her new marriage? Was it someone else entirely within that household? A servant? A rival? Someone whose name never surfaced prominently enough in the investigation to be remembered a century and a half later? Jealousy? Revenge? Money? Or something considerably more tangled, buried behind the respectable, polished walls of a Victorian country home that, from the outside, had looked like the picture of comfortable domestic success? We simply don't know. Right, that's the strange, unsolved death of Charles Bravo. Leave a comment below with your own theory, because, honestly, this is one of the rare cases where I genuinely don't have an answer to give you. And if anyone ever tells you a Victorian country house is simply what comfortable, respectable success looks like, perhaps ask a few more questions before you sit down to dinner. See you next time.